Welcome to Full Prefrontal, the show that exposes the mysteries of executive function. This podcast is a collection of conversations about the role of the prefrontal cortex, which impacts your focus, planning, problem-solving, emotional balance, and independence. So join us as we explore executive function and the science of learning. And now, here's your host, the founder of EXQ, Sucheta Kamath.
Welcome to Full Prefrontal, exposing the mysteries of executive function. As you have heard me say this many times, this podcast is fueled by three important goals. One is to explain what executive function is, what's the relationship between prefrontal cortex, your amygdala, and your process of building bridge towards the future or future self. And second thing is to help everyone connect with the plight of the current self, who is slightly socially distanced from the future self. And finally, to help people create a solid playbook, a personal guide, so that one can master not just executive function decision making, but live a life of fulfillment. While thinking about executive function and the future self, I'm very keen about the concept of the past, current, and future self continuity. And research shows that those who vividly envision their future self, the consequences of their present actions for the future self tend to do better. Those who feel a similarity between the future self and the present self tend to have more positive emotions. They tend to acknowledge the positive qualities of the future self more readily. And it ultimately leads to having a more meaningful connection to your decision-making for the future, which, of course, thoughts of the future self, particularly distant future self, my 10-year-old later self or the 20-year later self becomes very vague and opaque. One of my favorite British authors, Somerset Maugham, once wrote that what makes old age hard to bear is not the failing of one's faculties, mental and physical, but the burden of one's memories. A lot can be said about regret and contemplation, but one must travel far down the road of life to arrive at that point where suddenly our life decisions say more about who we are rather than what we did. This can be a painful or invigorating process depending on many factors, including openness to self-change, capacity to admit mistakes, and desire to stay connected to the past self to shape the journey of the future self. And that's why this special guest with me today, a conversation with him are really going to be very meaningful. So it's a great pleasure to have Dr. Damon, William Damon, again on our podcast, second time. Last time he was here to talk about Path to Purpose, but this time he has a twist. He's a professor at Stanford University and the director of the Stanford Center on Adolescence. He's a leading scholar of human development across the lifespan and the author of The Path to Purpose. But in addition, he recently published his book called A Round of Golf with My Father, The New Psychology of Exploring Your Life to Make Peace with Your Present, is an examination, which is an examination of using a life review to renew personal identity and forge a purposeful direction moving forward. Welcome, Bill. How are you?
I'm great, and it's so nice to be with you again, Sucheta.
Absolutely. So let's start with this psychological idea called self-concept. What is the idea behind this self-concept, and as a developmental process, how does it emerge?
The self-concept is always alive and growing. It's a movie and not a snapshot. And I think that's something that people at all ages need to embrace, because I think that people often get fixed in their idea that I am who I am. Maybe I was determined by my genes or by my early experience. And none of that is the case. A lot of who we are is shaped by who we want to be, shaped by our visions, our beliefs, our aspirations. And so at every point in life, from as soon as we can begin reflecting on who we are, which begins certainly by the end of childhood, right up until the last moment of life, we have some agency, some capacity to make choices that will determine the kind of person we want to be. And my new book is an examination of exactly how you do that by thinking about your past in the most positive and most effective manner, and not be trapped by your past, but rather use your past as a growth opportunity.
I started there because I think, and thank you for connecting to your book, because I think when you're a developmental psychologist, and my interest as a speech language pathologist, but also somebody who sees the overlap between multiple sciences and fields, as we think about executive function, we really need to understand that developing agency, developing a sense of connectedness to the notion of I am capable of this, I want to become this, is a bridge between what I am not doing right now and how I can get there, where I'm doing the things that will help me define as a better person. And, a lot of research talks about how executive function is connected with morality, or contentment, or the sense of justice, compassion, because we are kind of holding ourselves to certain principles and using ourselves impulse control or self-control through that lens. And so thank you for setting the stage for this conversation. Before I jump into your book, you connect this process in this book vividly, which is called the process of life review, a concept that was put forth by a psychiatrist in 50s, I think, Dr. Butler, if I'm correct. So what does the process of life review mean? And can a life review help you identify and strengthen your purpose in life?
Yes. Well, the answer, I believe, is yes. And as you said, this idea was developed by Robert Butler, who was a legendary psychiatrist who became the first head of the National Institute of Aging in the United States, and actually coined the phrase ageism in a Pulitzer Prize winning book that he wrote. The life review is his idea of how to go over your life in the most productive way possible in your mind. We all go over our lives all the time anyway. We always tell life stories, even small life stories about the shopping trip we just took, or the vacation we took, or the family dinner we had. We're constantly telling life stories, and the life stories tell us and other people about who we are. But we usually do them in a haphazard, kind of random way. And sometimes we don't even represent what happened very accurately. And I go into my book a lot about the science of memory and the psychology of memory, which is very imperfect, and it is a construction. And Butler's point was that if we go over our lives in a systematic, intentional way, where we focus on the kinds of purposes we've had, the kinds of things that have given us satisfaction, the kinds of contributions we've made. And when we do think of our mistakes and our regrets, and that is part of our life, every human being has made mistakes, everybody, all of us, and all of us have certain regrets. And it's important to confront them, but not to dwell on them, not to get hung up on them, and not to think that they define who you are. You can learn from your mistakes, and your regrets can be even part of a productive understanding of who you want to be, because you have some understanding of things that you would not do again. Or perhaps a regret might have ended up leading you to the person you are anyway, which is something you need to embrace and affirm. So the life review, to say it very simply, is a way of going over your past history in a systematic way, an intentional way, towards the mission of creating the future self that you want to be. And understanding what you've learned from your past, understanding what you want to retain, understanding how you can develop and build it in the future. And it was a method that Butler believed in, even though he never really had a chance to develop it much when he went on to become a public figure. He was no longer a bench researcher, a scientist in that sense. And so it was kind of a method out there waiting to be tried out. And that's what I did in my book. I tried out the life review on a single case, which was me. And I found it personally very not only very satisfying, but also helping me deal with things that I had long put myself, batted away. I had very long denied and not really confronted in the way that would eventually be important to give myself peace of mind and further optimism and hope for the future.
So I'm going to pick on this point that you were talking about a minute ago. So one thing in Butler's work comes up is that this is a universal mental process. It's naturally occurring. And typically, though, culturally speaking, or maybe, in the context of age, who pauses more often? Those who have are in their sunset years and not necessarily people made, at age 15, if you pause and look back, you don't have a long standing history with self. And so I do want you to share about that as to, does this journey look different for different ages? And I want to insert this idea in Marathi, my mother tongue. I speak 5 languages, and in Sanskrit, this is a Sanskrit word, but it's called Sinhavalokan, which actually doesn't translate, or maybe there's another English word you can tell me, but it's a typical process described to look back, and which actually means like a lion, you come to the top of the hill and look at the entire savannah and look back the traveling you have done. And this is it's a beautiful concept. When I was growing up, all throughout my high school years, we would have assignments to write about Sinhavalokan, like looking back. And I don't know if you have such a word where you stand atop of something to look back the entire scope of your journey, so that, and one of the comedians used to say this, look back to look ahead, right? Yeah. So I'm wondering what are your thoughts about what the right junctures in your time of life are to look back? Rather, what I heard you say is it should be done often enough. But I think I see a couple of things, barriers. One is sensitivity. Now, when your sense of self as not matured enough, then you are looking back and you're going to look at your mistakes with great, anxiety or angst. But also, you don't have enough accomplishments to say anything about who you are yet.
Well, it's true that the longer you live, the more you have to look back on. But I believe that at any age, beginning at least towards the end of adolescence, you can get a lot of information about who you want to be from experiences that you've had in the past and what they've meant to you. And so to answer your question about when is particularly productive to look back, I think that any transition point in development. So for example, graduation, I'm glad to hear that you were asked to do this during high school, because I think that is productive. And it also gets you into the habit of doing this, of reflecting about your past in order, and you said this very, very nicely, in order to look towards the future in a wise and insightful way. So I think that all through life, at any transition, when you graduate school, when you take on a new job, when you switch jobs, when you begin to form a family, when your children grow up, when you retire from your first job and look for encore kinds of purposes in life, at any point in life, I think it's helpful to do this kind of survey. I suppose that's the word we would use. You kind of survey your life and make some judgments about what has worked, what has not worked, what I can learn from this, what I should be taking satisfaction and pride from, and what I need to change. Because we always should have that kind of humility of thinking that no matter what we've done in life, what we've accomplished, there's new challenges that we need to rise to, and there's new skills that we can develop at any age. So I think I am a lifespan developmental psychologist, and I do believe that development continues throughout life. And the reason it continues throughout life is that we remain open-minded and interested in changing, in growing. And as long as we keep that growth mindset, we can have a very positive, future-oriented life.
Love that. And I think thank you for kind of particularly listeners who are parents and educators for younger children. This is such an invaluable advice, because I think we shouldn't pass, like I was setting the stage saying that, do I have enough to look back at? Yes. You're saying yes. There's ample to look back at, because there's so much more to forge forward with.
Yes.
That's great.
And as you know, Sucheta, most of my work, at least in the later periods of my career, has been on the concept of purpose and how young people find purpose, how people in midlife continue their purpose, how older people find new purposes. And purpose is a very forward-looking concept. It's the idea that we have aspirations to contribute something to the world, and something beyond the self that's meaningful to the self. But even though it's forward-looking, a lot of our decisions about what kinds of purposes we are best served by dedicating ourselves to, a lot of those choices are made by looking back at what we have done in the past that we've been successful at, that we have found interesting, that we've believe in, that fit our capacities and our talents. So even with a very forward-looking concept like purpose, it requires, in order to make good decisions, it requires the kind of self-knowledge that comes from a survey of our past experiences.
Yeah, I think that really makes sense. So let's talk about your life story. It's interesting. Before we started recording, I was saying this, that sometimes the life review process comes about in a natural way. Sometimes we are nudged into it, and sometimes we may be reluctant because what we may find that we may not be ready for. And you have a very interesting story that you tell about your own process of looking back at your absentee father, and how much time and energy you had invested in finding out more about him. But tell us that story. And I really appreciated how open you were, and how you took your daughter's invitation to explore it. I think that just tells how you are committed to lifelong learning process yourself.
Well, yes, although I have to admit this is one of these cases where a parent learns a lot from his child, and because
Yes.
this was an area in my life, even though I am a developmental psychologist, I was not really following my own prescriptions because I had a difficult life situation, especially early in life. My father abandoned my mother and me at my birth, and I never met him. I never even saw a picture of him. And my mother did not reveal to me what really happened to him. For the first 20 years of my life, all she ever told me about him was that he was, quote, missing in World War II. And he was serving in Germany on the lines there, and he did not come back. And I assumed that he was killed. He was killed in action. And everyone around me maintained that bubble of a mystery, even though a lot of them knew better. And my mother finally confronted me with the truth when I was in college, but I was so embarrassed, and it was such an awkward conversation that she basically revealed to me that she had hidden the truth for my whole youth, that I never had a full conversation with her about that. My whole discussion with her on this lasted about a minute. And then for the next 42 years of her life, until she died, we never raised the subject again. So I went through the rest of my life.
Can I quickly ask you, that was such an interesting moment that you described, that as a young man, you never responded, even emotionally or curiosity wise. What happened? What made this? Because she did bring it up that he was supporting, providing child support, right?
Right. And it was because I did not want to identify with someone who I assumed was a no good scoundrel who had abandoned his wife and child. And I wanted nothing to do with this person. And I was a young man growing up, and I understood even then the importance of father-son identification. And I didn't want a negative role model. And it was also something I think I didn't have the courage to really have a full conversation with my mother about it. I thought it would be a very emotionally difficult, uncomfortable conversation. And I have to say, for the next 40 years of my life, I avoided it. All the clues that came about, and there were some, I just batted them away. I buried them. And I think that was a mistake. I wish I had earlier in life been bold enough to find out the truth, because when I discovered later, after my daughter was the one that revealed the truth to me. She called me one night. She's an economist, and she had spent a sleepless night in Cape Town, South Africa on jet lag, and got curious about her grandfather, who she never met. And she called me and she said, "Dad, I don't want to upset you, but I found out some information." That got me going. I was ready to hear that at that point. I was in my early 60s, and I was secure enough that I could take the risk of finding out. And what I found out, basically, and I write about this in the book, I unraveled a whole series of mysteries about this man. And it turned out that he was not a no good scoundrel. He had quite a consequential life. It did not excuse his irresponsibility for abandoning my mother and me, but it turned out that he had a life of contribution to the Foreign Service. He had some moral courage at one point in his Army career that I was able to investigate. He was a great golfer, and that was one of the that's the reason I titled the book "A Round of Golf with My Father," because I love golf myself, but I'm not a great golfer. But finding out about that, I wrote it in the book about doing an imaginary round of golf with him. He had been long dead, but it was kind of a bonding experience, and it did provide me a path for respecting him and eventually forgiving him when I found out all of these positive things about his life. And I also discovered that he had a family, a second family, with daughters who became my very treasured half sisters after I finally took the initiative to find out about all this. So in my book, it's really a case study of someone, me, who finally got up the courage to confront his past and deal with the regrets and resentments that I had in a positive way, rather than, because the past will always catch up with you. I quote Faulkner in the book, who said very famously, "The past is not dead.
Never.
It's not even past.
Not even past.
It's part of who we are, and you can't really avoid it." And so it's important to confront the difficulties, the hardships, the regrets, the mistakes you made, because I did make a mistake by not following up on this and having the conversation with my mother, and confronting them in a way that you learn from them, and you learn to accept who you are now and figure out how to become a better person in a way that doesn't recapitulate the old mistakes, but rather moves forward in a growth kind of manner.
it's interesting the way you write about one, of course, very curious phenomenon was that you actually had access to who your father was as a young man or as a child. You both went to a Phillips Academy, and you dug some records of his academic performance, and even the letter that his parents wrote, which I thought was unique. And you saw some of the young mind who was not as mature as could be at that age, and having a child at young age could be, and the decision he took to abandon could be reflected in some of the ways he approached life. Compared to you sounded you had your stuff together at a much younger age.
Yes.
So did this information, and also your relationship with your mom, who didn't talk about it, but had this beautiful letter where he addresses her as a dear pie face, right? So
Yes.
I'm just curious, how did you reconcile with your anger about some discoveries, that the fact that your father went ahead and had another family, that means he was interested in having a family, but never really, and yet lived a very meaningful and purposeful, impactful life, but didn't share that with you. But it's your openness and maybe gracious heart that you forgave him, if you think it that way. I was just curious, how did you reconcile as you took an inventory of this life review method?
Yes. Well, first of all, let me say that forgiving someone is not only good for that person. Of course, my father was dead at that point, so it did him no good. But when you are able to forgive somebody, it does you a lot of good. It gives you a peace of mind.
Yes.
Is much better than holding on to bitterness and anger. So that was a favor I did for myself, was to find a way to forgive him. And the way I did that was by doing the kind of research that you mentioned, which is thrilling, and everybody can do this. I write about this in the book, that I'm an amateur historian. I knew nothing about how to do this kind of research, but everyone can find out records about their parents, about themselves. I looked for old school records. I interviewed people who knew my father when he was young. And this is a process that I think is beneficial, and it doesn't take an expert to do it. And the kinds of things I discovered, just to give you an example, I had no idea that my father went to the same school that I went to, that he had gone to Phillips Academy. I never even knew why I ended up there, because I came from because he had abandoned us. We were not well off. We were not living in the kind of environment that we even knew about these kinds of places. But obviously my mother did know about it because of my father. And so my father's educational journey had a tremendous effect on my life that I never even knew about. And these were the kinds of discoveries that I made about not only my father's life, but about my life and how his existence affected me, that gave me a much richer understanding of who I was, where I came from, what made a difference in my life. And as far as my father is concerned, as you said, I had a lot to forgive him for. I mean, he had hurt my mother very badly by not coming back from Germany. And I often said, there were a lot of things that I never got to learn about about growing up that people can learn from having a father. And I had to figure all that out myself. But understanding that he, as a young student, was irresponsible, that was part of who he was, and learning about his life and how he eventually developed a kind of a moral maturity that he never had, and that he obviously did not have at the point when he abandoned my mother and me. But learning about how he continued to develop and was able to eventually develop the kind of character that could contribute to the world, that could raise a fine family, a second family. It did give me a path to not completely excuse his irresponsibility, but a path towards respecting him and forgiving him. And that did me a lot of good. It gave me a lot of peace and security and confidence, rather than thinking that this person was just a no good scoundrel.
And so, recently I came across Ashley Ford's biography or novel, and she talks about, it's called Someone's Daughter. And it's an interesting, as I was reading your book, it just reminded me of another, approach to this life review. But she, as a young girl, knew her father was in prison. And she writes that her mother would go in a fit of rage if any of the children asked why dad was in prison. And she just, as a young mind, constructed this image that he's there. Probably the worst of the worst could be a murder. And then when she was 13, she found out that it was actually for a rape. And at that age, she was herself 6 months earlier been raped. And so I think there was something she discovered about her life as she took a life review, not so reconcilable, right?
Right.
And then she talks about her coming to terms process. So how do you see how this process works out when you look back and some things that are out of your control are not so savory or also quite traumatic? And secondly, what if you yourself have taken very poor decisions? So like, I'm wondering, as I read, I wondered to myself, what would your dad's life review process would look like? If he looked back, and would he write a letter to young Bill and say, I'm so sorry? I'm just curious about that.
Yeah, these are terrific questions, and they're right at the heart of the matter. And as I write in my book, there are some instances in life. There are some things that happen in life that are not for the better. That you can't fool yourself into thinking, well, this seemed hard at the time, but it was for the better in the long run, because life is full of catastrophes and tragedies and wounds that will not heal. And part of what you need to do, I think, in life review is make a distinction between events that happen that you truly just need to mourn, to say, life is tragic for many people in many ways. And if we're going to accept that we are alive and be affirmative about that, we have to accept that life has its share of hardships and things that went wrong that we need to say, this was tragic. It was awful. I wish this didn't happen, but it's part of life, and it is part of accepting that. And we would not be the people we are now. The world would not be the same now if they had not happened. And so if we're going to accept the way we are, we have to accept them, even though we accept them with sadness. And so there are those kinds of incidents that are just that are simply irreconcilable in that sense. But if you think about other kinds of regrets, other kinds of mistakes that people made, I mean, to give you an example, I understood my father's abandonment of me as something that made my life difficult, and yet gave me certain strengths that I would not have had if he had been there. And if he had come back, and if he had not gotten along well with my mother, there could have been all kinds of other problems. So it's never a simple case of saying, well, I wish this hadn't happened. There are some cases that are clearly tragic, but in many, many cases, even though they've made your life more difficult and more challenging, there are ways to think about them that you can find the positive aspect of it and find what you can learn from it. And I write at length in my book about exactly that, about how you can think about these things to make that distinction, and to find ways that you, in any case, whatever you do. And I'm going to quote here from the great psychiatrist Viktor Frankl. who went through the Holocaust in a concentration camp and wrote the wonderful book, Man's Search for Meaning, out of it, that influenced my work on purpose a lot. Now, the original title of his book is not Man's Search for Meaning. The original title of his book in the German was Nevertheless Say Yes to Life. And that's really the message. I mean, that's, I think it was actually, unfortunately, mistranslated when it was called Man's Search for Meaning, because that's really a wonderful message, which is, yes, bad things happen. And of course, it's awful that the Holocaust happened. And it's awful that every single thing you mentioned, and we wish it didn't happen. And we mourn that happened. But still, nevertheless, we should say yes to life, even though awful, awful, terrible, horrible things happen. And that's really the message that I think needs to come across. It's something I learned from Viktor Frankl. And I think a lot of my book is exactly about that, about how to say yes and all the varieties of ways we can respond to these different types of events, some of which we can learn from, some of which we're actually better off, even though they seem difficult, and some of which really it's awful that they happen, but nevertheless, we should affirm our lives.
I love that. It's a funny connection, but there's a movie called Rewrite, where Hugh Grant is the lead. And it's an interesting story of a, deadbeat writer who had one hit wonder, that a script that he writes becomes a very famous and very successful, commercially successful, movie. And 15 years go by and he cannot get that same success. And so he's struggling. And then he approaches his agent and say, I need a job. Like I'm in trouble. Financial trouble. So he finds his summer job of becoming a writing instructor at a writing institute. And so college kids, it's a writing workshop. And it's so interesting. He arrives, he does not want to be there. He doesn't like the job. He doesn't want to give any feedback to students. He looks down upon their effort, who are just budding writers. So anyway, but finally, when he gets into it, there's one little young student who keeps writing about her bat mitzvah event. Something happened during the bat mitzvah. That's all the story she has. And so she talks deeply, passionately about why she's writing it, because, her feelings were hurt or something. And so Hugh Grant says to her, I understand why you're writing this, but your character is paper thin. And I love that the character had no depth, no body, though no richness. And I feel adversity in a way is what gets us away from being paper thin lives, leading these meaningless, paper thin, obstruction free lives. So we do want some robust obstacles that shape us, right?
That's wonderful. Yes, life is complicated, and we should be complicated too. We should contain multitudes.
And that's exactly, he said, your character has no complications.
That's great.
And I love that, because that just reminds me that we should embrace, because that's, we don't stay paper thin. Then maybe one day we become a big encyclopedia, Yeah,
I think that's great. And that is the lesson I learned. As I said, even though I'm a developmental psychologist, I still have a lot to learn. And when my daughter forced me to confront my own past and the regrets that I had, which I had been denying. I mean, I had a lot of regrets and resentment about my father, which I refused to think about. But when I really, I also quote the Frank Sinatra song where he said, regrets, I've had a few, but then again, too few to mention. And that sounds very plucky.
Yes,
I always believed that. I thought, don't look back. This is the way to go through life. But it's not the recipe for the best mental health, I think. And you should confront your problems and confront your difficulties. And as you said, embrace them. They're part of who you are. And that really is the lesson that I learned and that I write it in the book about, which is confronting regrets in a way that does not deny them, doesn't say, oh, I don't need to think about these things, but to say, well, what is it really that I regret? And what's legitimate to regret? What can I learn from that? What do I regret that maybe I shouldn't even regret? And that is what the life review is. And when I write about the method of the life review, that's how I describe it. And that's how I did it in my own case.
And as another thing that popped up in my head as I read your book was, you had a fixed image of your dad, and that was really essential for you to survive. Because how do you reconcile with abandonment, right? You had to paint him to be a bad guy. So as you went through this discovery process, he didn't turn out to be as bad as you wanted him to be. I'm saying wanted him, but you know what I mean? It was essential for your identity to know or blame your suffering on absentee dad. And suddenly when you see this guy who's a pretty decent person, accomplished person, a person who actually showed all the concerns and care that would have made him a good father if he had matured in time for you, your arrival.
Yeah.
But I think that was such a healthy, I really loved your own psychological application of your journey or all the science to your own self and saying, yeah, he wasn't that bad.
Yeah.
Which kind of sometimes we are resistant to accept that.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. And there was, to be honest, there was some pain in that because then I had to confront a new regret, which is if I had been more open-minded earlier in my life and allowed myself to explore this, I could have met him and I could have met his family much earlier than I did. And that was a mistake. And it was a mistake I had to learn something from. So it was a new journey into self-exploration. But I do think, as you said, that in the end, this was difficult and painful, but of course, without pain, you sometimes don't grow. And so I think that it was very. I mean, it's a story of a journey that I took that was very worthwhile, even though there were a lot of ups and downs, discoveries that were painful at the time that later gave me a lot of insight that I think is helping me now and in the future.
It's great. I remember every time I look back at my life, I kind of did some exploration along the lines that you recommend, that I often tend to talk about my challenges or problems because they really shaped the way they either challenged my preconceived notions or they actually told a lot more or talked about a lot more about my substance in a way. One quick story that when I came to US, I came with a scholarship to become a TA. I was a TA in a communications disorders department, working with a world-renowned expert who was a phonology expert. And I had my master's in linguistics and I was coming for a second master's. So I was given a very specific job. She used to teach introductory linguistics to undergraduate students. And my job was to TA her class. And the first quiz that happened, I got 80 papers to correct. And so the quiz was that she orally dictated words and using international phonetic language, you had to transcribe it. And so for that, I knew international phonetic language, back of my hand. So kids, she dictated and the kids wrote the phonetic transcription and I had to take it and correct. And I finished within a day, I finished my assignment. I brought it back on Monday and I said, I'm sorry, Dr. Folks, but you don't have a smart class. She said, why? So I said, 90% of kids have failed. She said, what? And she couldn't believe her eyes because she said, this has never happened. And then she looked through all the papers and there was no failure. They had not failed. Guess who had failed? So as English as a second language speaker, so when you say the word OF, right? It's OF in India, you would pronounce this as off. And America, it will be pronounced as of.
Right.
And v sound. So when you transcribed, it's a completely different ballgame. So I am transcribing the written word, and she wanted me to do the spoken word. So I'm not even paying attention to it. So anyways, but what was so amazing at that moment, she had a mini panic attack. Who did I hire? But then she also said to herself, okay, I see your talent. I'm going to put you in this Cantonese and Mandarin language speakers speaking English, and you transcribe them, because your transcription is stellar. But it's just the English to English is a little bit of a problem.
There you go.
And then I was in this lab for the whole year with the headphones, transcribing. It worked great. It could have completely crumbled me. That was embarrassing to me. If you think about it, I had this knowledge and ability, which I thought was great, and I bombed. But that just told me so many things about her and me.
Oh, terrific.
And our relationship, And anyway, so I do see that in your story too, that openness with which you learn. So tell us a little bit about a few things that you recommend our listeners. How can they engage in this life review process? And while curtailing the regret, or focus on regret, and looking at failure with great wide-minded attitude.
Yeah. Well, I recommend the work of the psychologist Dan McAdams, who's at Northwestern University. And he's written books about narrative identity, which is basically the idea of developing your self-concept through this kind of process. And he's developed, I think, the best methods, the most rigorous methods for interviewing yourself. And in my book, I refer to his work a lot. So Dan McAdams's work, either his articles or his books, there's work on what's called prospective thinking, which is how you can think about the future in a way that is inviting you to use your imagination and your beliefs to shape the kind of person you are. And the person that's written mostly about that is Martin Seligman and Roy Baumeister. And so they have a book on human perspection, and I recommend that. And of course, if people are interested in my story, the story of how my daughter my daughter introduced me to my father. That's the way I put it, and introduced me to the need to do a life review. The title of my book is called A Round of Golf with My Father: The New Psychology of Exploring Your Past to Make Peace with Your Present. And just as a word, the round of golf was really the idea that was the thing I ended up being most bitter about, that I didn't even realize, was that the guy never came by to teach me how to play golf. And I had to get over that because as I said, I found out he was a great golfer and I love golf, but it was emblematic. It was really representative of all the things he never did for me. And so I did this kind of cathartic journey to his old golf course to play golf with an old scorecard of his that I uncovered, and pretending he was there with me. And that was the symbol of my whole journey. So that's why I called the book A Round of Golf with My Father. And in that book, I do go into how I did the life review for myself and my father and my mother too, who played a role in that as well.
I think it's so sweet that, as a experienced professional, you are in your full adulthood, and yet that craving we all have to be connected and seen and heard by our parents, and mostly be able to show that, the title of the movie, Kids Will Be All Right, like just your way of demonstrating, I'm all right, Dad. It's very touching to me. I think a lot about that. Actually, my mom lives with me. My dad passed away several years ago, 13 years ago almost. And I do keep stories that she tells because through her stories, I really so much richness. Knowing that people have lived rich lives, it just, one, gives you a perspective that hardship is not unique to you, but it also gives you so much encouragement that I have that same fabric in me. I have that same, that DNA in me. So I'm sure you feel very, very, relieved. So with that, what have you imparted to your children with this backdrop of your own personal experience that is a little bit different if you didn't grow up with that background of your father abandoning you?
With my children, I am really emphasizing the importance of family, and family, even the family that you don't know, or if there are family mysteries. And a lot of people have family mysteries, or people that didn't come through for them, or people that disappointed them in a lot of ways. But what I try to tell my children, and of course it doesn't even have to necessarily be kinship family. It could be the families that you build through your very deep friendships in life. But family type relationships where you are just totally dedicated to another person and you would do anything for them, including forgive them if they make a mistake or hurt you. That's really what I try to talk to my children about, and try to build in them that appreciation, because frankly, it took me a long period in my life to really understand that myself. I was slow to come to understand that. And so I'm hoping to give my children a bit more of a shortcut to that insight about how important family and family type relationships are, and dedicating yourself to other people in the way that you would dedicate yourself to your children, to your siblings, to your parents, and so on.
What an invaluable lesson. So as we end our conversation, you have made several recommendations, including your own book, which we are going to have in our show notes. Any parting thoughts about just general, as we think about leading a meaningful life, the hardship, what I'm getting again and again, is something to be not feared. And with your own boldness, I feel you're kind of not only preached, but practiced, so to speak. Any other closing thoughts?
My final thought is never give up. Sometimes these painful memories seem so difficult that you really are tempted to say, oh, gee, why deal with this at all? It's too hard. And I think my closing message is, keep at it, because it's worth the struggle.
Well, all right. That's all the time we have today. As you can see, these are important conversations we are having with knowledgeable, incredibly qualified and passionate experts with unique perspective on executive function, living a meaningful life, pursuing a life of purpose, and occasionally pausing to reflect so that some of your decisions, even if they were wrong, can be righted by relating to them correctly or better ways. Or maybe you get a second chance to redo some of the parts that you're not too content with. And continue to stay connected. If you love what you're hearing, do share the episode with your friends and colleagues and your family too. And if you have a moment, leave us a review. Thank you for connecting from all walks of life, from all over the world, and looking forward to connecting again next time here on Full Prefrontal. Thank you, Bill.
Thank you very much, Sujata.
Thank you for listening to Full Prefrontal, exposing the mysteries of executive function. To contact your host, Sucheta Kamath, and learn more about her work on improving executive function, visit her website at exqinfiniteknowhow.com. That's www.exqinfiniteknowhow.com. Tune in next week for another informative episode of Full Prefrontal, hosted by the founder of EXQ, Sucheta Kamath.